You see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
I'd like to introduce Frank Telep. Frank's been here before, I think.
Dan.
Oh, excuse me. Okay, Dan. Okay, we got that correct. I'm just sort of a stand-in for Jerry Ropo today. So you see what untrained talent does. Yeah, Dan has been here before, and we're looking forward to his presentation. So with that, I'll introduce Dan Telep.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And his wife, Kitty.
Yeah.
Can we
And his wife, Kitty.
Yeah.
Oh, you're the tech.
Yeah.
Okay, anybody else in your posse?
Yeah, there's one in the corner I'm going to talk about in a minute.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, my wife and I have been married 52 years. She's tolerated me for this long, brothers. And one issue was when she met somebody, where do you vacation? It's either stamp shows, antique shops, or Civil War battlefields. That's our life together for the last 52 years. But before I get started, I want to acknowledge a young man who had pimples on his face. He was 17 years old, and there was a place called Utah Beach. And on June 6, 1944, we have a brother here who went over his head, rifle above his hand, landed on a Utah beach, Warren Goss, and I want to dedicate this presentation to Warren Goss. That's you, sir, over in the left-hand side there. That's you. Okay. We're going to talk a little bit about one of my favorite subjects. Can we turn the lights off?
Yeah.
Okay. I met Rick earlier in the back of the corner, and he said, Dan, I said, what do you expect today? He said, to be entertained. So I am going to be in the entertaining business today. Sherm, it's good to see you as well, and Gary, always a pleasure to see you. As a young boy growing up, I fell in love with the American Civil War. My mother gave me a book to read because I couldn't read. I had a terrible, I never learned phonics. And so suddenly I'm reading about the American Civil War. I'm a stamp collector, so I started collecting Confederate stamps as a youngster. That was, maybe 10th grade in high school or something. So I want to talk you through the military postal history of the American Civil War from the Confederate side as well as the Union side. Kitty, let's go next. Postal history. Basically, there's an envelope with a stamp on it, and it has a cancellation. Sometimes they even have a letter inside. And recently in Baltimore, I met a youngster. He was 94 years old, and he was from Sharpsburg, Maryland. And I asked him, I said, Sharpsburg, Antietam? He said, yes, I collect letters from Antietam in the battlefield. Well, I have one, and it talks about the casualties that occurred and how the Confederates were being buried by Union soldiers simply because they didn't have, obviously the Confederates had left the field. And so postal history students study the philatelic aspects then of the American Civil War. Next. And how did things get started? Well, there was an organization in the Legislative Assembly at South Carolina, and on December 20, 1860, they said, we've had enough. We've had enough of this federal union business. Abraham Lincoln has just been elected President of the United States. We want to expand slavery into the territories where states had not yet been formed, and we are officially out. Next. The next, then on February 4, a new government formed in Montgomery, Alabama on February 4, 1861. Now, how many of you are stamp collectors? Just out of curiosity, show of hands. Okay. Have you heard about first day covers and how popular first day covers are? And today, if you go into an antique shop, you can buy a first day cover for maybe $1, $2. Well, this is a first day cover from Montgomery, Alabama, February 4, 1861. So it just so happened that someone mailed a letter the very day the Confederate government was formed. You're looking at an envelope and a piece of paper that today probably will bring somewhere between $4,000 to $5,000. First day cover, Confederacy, February 4. I never owned one, but that is an absolute gem. Next. When the conflict did occur, there had to be someone who took the reins of managing this postal system. And President Davis tapped John Reagan on the shoulder and said, I want you to be postmaster of the United States. Montgomery Blair was the post office, or was the postmaster on the federal side, but just for information, John Reagan, in from Texas, ran such a tight ship that the Confederacy generated income from its postal operations that fed, if you will, the legitimacy of the Confederacy, and was a cash contributor to the war from that point of view. Now, in February 4, 1861, there was then the illegitimate usage of United States stamps. Confederate little towns said to themselves, well, what do we do? We're going to have to find some way of creating our own stamps and our own adhesives before the government of the Confederacy actually gives us treasures that we can use and put on envelopes. So this little town in Florida just happens to be Madison, Florida, and they actually created their own adhesive stamp. The postmaster there created this own adhesive stamp. In the world, there are only 6 copies of this. And that is a real treasure for someone who, like myself, would be a philatelist. It's called a postmaster provisional. Next, Kitty. Now, once the states did secede, before the government was formed, example, Virginia didn't join the Confederacy until, what was it, May 7, 61. So there was this period called independent statehood. So here we have an example from Lexington, Virginia, April 27, 1861, federally used on an envelope. Virginia had not yet seceded from the Union. They were no longer a part of, if you will, the Confederacy. They had seceded from the Union, or no longer part of the Confederacy. So you have this period called independent statehood. Next. Finally, on June 1, there is officially the first day of the Confederate Post Office being established. Here you have a federal stamp that was issued in 1851, used June 1st, and it no longer was valid, so the Confederate postmaster at this time applied the paid 5 cents. So it was 5 cents to send a letter under 300 miles, 10 cents over 300 miles. And this is an example of first day usage of the Confederacy. Yes, next. Alexander Stephens was the vice president of the Confederacy, and one of the things that collectors like myself are always looking for would be an envelope addressed to a dignitary, if you will, of some kind. And so when you have the postmark itself, the cancellation, the adhesive, possibly a letter. When you have someone like a personality like Stevens on an envelope, that adds tremendous value, not only to the cost, but more important, to your exhibit. When I was a youngster back in Winchester, Virginia, Kitty and I were living there. I was with Rubbermaid before I came to Pittsburgh. I'm at an antique show, a flea market, and I open up this bunch of paper, and here is a letter postmarked free, Robert E. Lee. So I actually bought and owned a Robert E. Lee free frank. I paid, I think we paid maybe $300 or $400 for that. It sold for $12,000 when we sold my collection, 30 years later. But look then as a collector on, for different auditory dignitaries on envelopes. Next. Smaller towns did not have hand-stamped postmarks, so in this case, this little burg, Belfast Mills, Virginia, probably only 50 people lived in, but they didn't have a traffic light sherm, and paid 5 cents in the upper right-hand corner. Yes, next. Now, cities like Memphis, Tennessee, Knoxville, places especially in Tennessee, they actually created their own adhesive postage stamps. So Memphis created these, particularly 2 examples. They're beautiful. One is the 2-cent rate for local delivery, 5 cents for under 300 miles. And that provision I'll uncover today is a very nice one. So that's just the stamp itself. Next. Here are other provisional Confederate towns and postmasters manufacturing, if you will, their own stamps, because the Confederate government had not yet built, if you will, or made available to the public the stamps. The lower right-hand corner, the very famous Livingston provisional. The Coleman and Law Company, this blue one, or this is a bookmark. Right here, this is a bookmark, if you will, off for books. The postmaster just began to use those from Gonzales, Texas. Next. How did mail get delivered? Pretty simple. Horse and wagon. Finally, the Confederate government did in fact manufacture its own adhesives. Now, if you were in a small town in North Carolina and you just found out that we have a brand new president, his name is Jefferson Davis, you've never seen him before, you don't know what it looks like. So this was the first time that a government manufactured adhesive postage stamps of live people. So this is Jefferson Davis's portrait on a Confederate stamp. The earliest recorded use, October 16, 1861. Beautiful stamp. These are all lithographed. Next. Other Confederate general issues followed, and one hero of the South was Thomas Jefferson. 2 different shades, blue and a red buff. And these were issued as well. Next. Other heroes, if you will, George Washington, Andrew Jackson, and John C. Calhoun. So these are, again, 3 other postage stamps that the Confederate government offered. Can you see okay? Am I in your way?
Just a little bit further back.
How's that? Okay?
That's good.
There was also a demand for adhesives and paper shortages in the Confederacy. So the Confederate government negotiated with a manufacturer of stamps, De La Rue and Company in London, and these came across the Atlantic Ocean through the blockade, and one was printed in London and used for about a year, and then the plates were shipped to Richmond and reprinted plates in new adhesives, darker colors, in Richmond, Virginia. So we have the Thomas De La Rue and Company in London, England, manufacturing that particular adhesive. Next. Andrew Jackson. The stamp on the right-hand side, the 2-cent Black Jackson, would have been used if someone was already in a city like Philadelphia, and you dropped a letter in the post office at Philadelphia for someone living in Philadelphia. That was a 2-cent rate. Well, the Confederacy had the same idea of what would happen if someone sent a letter to someone in the same town, and they copied basically the design of the Andrew Jackson adhesive that was in the United States back in 1863 or 1861, and this issue then is the 2-cent rate Andrew Jackson for the Confederacy. Same design. The word TEN was spelled out on this particular adhesive as opposed to 10. Gorgeous, absolutely a beautiful stamp. Next. And finally, the frame line was designed on a sheet of 100 per sheet. So there were 100 stamps, and because there were no perforations, the postmaster here designed lines where you could cut so that it was a way of being able to separate the stamps and just by following the line. So it's called the frame line. It's based on these two designs as well, with the 10 and the 10, type 1 and type 2. Next. Now, the United States, back in June of '61, had a stamp that was already available, the old 3-cent 1857 in your lower right-hand corner. It was demonetized because there were such supplies available in the South. It was basically cash that could have been used for whatever purposes other than postage. So the United States government said it's illegal to use that stamp anymore on the right-hand side, lower right, and they issued this new US 1861 issue, the 3-cent rose. So the stamp on the left-hand side that Kitty just went through, that one right there, there are literally hundreds of thousands of examples of this on cover. It's a very common Civil War item to own, and those stamps on cover today can still be bought with an envelope for $5 to $10. They're not that expensive, but it's fun to collect different towns and different shades and things along those lines. Next. Once, keep going, Kitty. Go forward, yeah, we'll go forward. Here was the 1-cent stamp on the lower right-hand side being demonetized, and the new 1-cent 61 issue being used. Next. Here we have an example of the stamp initially thinking, the writer being able to say, I think I can get away with it, and the answer to that question was no, you could not get away with it. The postmaster did not allow it, and he said, old stamps not recognized, with the hand stamp, and then the new 1861 issue being added on by the recipient in Detroit, or by the sender in Detroit, or sender who was sending it to Detroit. Held for postage, a very nice little usage in a hand stamp. Next. Here are other examples of different special markings and hand stamps that would be used on mail. Now, when you have something like mail suspended, old stamps not recognized, mails suspended north to south, it just adds so much more significance to the item because it takes it up another level than just a common envelope. So these are really valuable hand stamps that are very nice to be able to have and own in your collection when you exhibit. Next. Southern letter unpaid. So in this case, I think we have Louisville, Kentucky. The postmaster held the letter and actually stamped Southern letter unpaid, due 3 cents, because they would not allow the usage, if you will, of that particular adhesive going through the mails. Very, very rare item. Southern letter unpaid today, there are probably maybe less than 25 in the United that are known by collectors, of which I am one. You're looking at a cover today that probably is worth somewhere in the area about $25,000. Next. Now, one really interesting dimension of collecting old envelopes and letters is to have patriotic covers that are a symbol, if you will, of patriotism to that particular cause. So what I'm going to do is show you here some that are both Confederate as well as Union. And this example is a classic one of a Confederate design. Why? Because it's the Confederate flag and it's used relatively early in the war. Next. Different designs in different corners. These would be printed on envelopes, usually in the left-hand corner of the envelope, different designs. And there are literally hundreds of different designs of Confederate envelopes. I'm only showing you here a handful just to give you a little taste of what they look like. Next, here are other examples of Confederate patriotic designs. Some are more scarce than others. This is one of my favorite covers. Now, I did not own this. This is not, when I say my favorite covers to look at. A friend of mine in Canton, Ohio, his name is Blake Myers, he sold his collection 25 years ago, but he owned this particular item. And this is, if you will, Abraham Lincoln upside down, tied to a tree with a Confederate flag in the upper left-hand corner. This is a philatelic gem. And there are a very small number of these still available. And the little note down in the corner, December 2013, this sold for more than $50,000. But to have a hanging Lincoln cover in your exhibit is quite an achievement, and there are very few people that can afford to even own one. And there are only 12 known that are recorded so far in philatelic circles. The stamp on the right-hand side from Camden, Mississippi cancellation is the Jefferson stamp that I showed you earlier, the lithograph. Next. Now, let's look at the Union side. Mothers, fathers, brothers, and sisters would send envelopes to their loved ones deployed in the field. This happens to be Standing Liberty with flag, and it's going overseas, or excuse me, it's coming from overseas. The envelope originated in Europe, and it's coming in Belgium. It's coming into New York. But what a lovely, lovely design that is. It's just a beautiful cover. Next. Here we have another campaign cover. This particular example also is going overseas to France. Another example of a Union patriotic cover from Philadelphia. Magnificent overall patriotic cover. Another hand-drawn, illustrated Union patriotic cover. So this is beautiful from Washington, D.C. Our chief, our leader, the mourning cover with the black on the border is exactly that. These are mourning covers that were used post-Appomattox after Lincoln was in fact assassinated. One of my favorite categories of envelopes would be the fact that during the war, the Confederacy was starved for paper. They did not have enough envelopes and letters to use, and they had to create and be very creative on how they manufactured envelopes. So the lower left-hand corner one is one of mine from Adams Run, South Carolina. There was a roll of wallpaper that was used to make 30, 40 different kinds of envelopes. The rest would be wallpaper covers or maybe printed envelopes, but to own a Confederate adversity cover is really a lovely way of displaying and seeing something other than just a standard envelope. Next. Beautiful wallpaper cover. No paper available, can't find an envelope. This happens to be from Robertsville, South Carolina, postmark from Robertsville, South Carolina. Next. There was a 20-cent green Jefferson or George Washington stamp used in the Confederacy, and the 20 cents would be the cost to send a letter across the Mississippi River. So in this case, if you didn't want to send a letter across the Mississippi River and you wanted to send it someplace within 300 miles, you would simply cut the 20-cent stamp in two. So the top is the bisect horizontal, the bottom, the lower right-hand corner is the vertical. These are really philatelic gems as well. Next. Because adversity and problems with getting envelopes is so difficult, senders would always, not always, occasionally turn envelopes inside and out and use them twice. So the lower right-hand corner, we have the lithograph of President Davis, and on the left-hand side, we have the adhesive from Jefferson Davis pictured as well. Next. Advertisements were the basis of how junk mail today. This is your standard, thank you, Kitty, it's your standard junk mail. But beautiful advertisements on envelopes on the lower left-hand, or not lower left-hand corner, but illustrating their wares. Express companies also had adhesive usages. This going to New York City. I'm not sure we know what the sender's address or what the originating office was. Next. We talked about MIAs and we talked about POWs just a minute ago. Here's an example of an attempt of a prisoner in Fort Delaware sending a cover to a loved one in the South. It had to bear the U.S. stamp to get it to the exchange point, and then the Confederate stamp taking it to its ultimate destination. This is a gem, gorgeous usage of a prisoner of war cover. Here's a south to north example, coming through the lines. The arrow points to something where it says examined, but this happens to be the infamous Andersonville prison camp. And at Andersonville, there are only, I can't imagine how many envelopes survived, but this is a major, major rarity by virtue of the fact that there was even an adhesive postage stamp available in Anderson. It must have been someone who was just incarcerated recently. Next. Prisoner of war mail, south to north. Gary, talk a little bit about the disaster here on the Mississippi River. Tell us a little bit about that story.
Well, what Dan is referring to is a steamboat Sultana carried overloaded, and unfortunately many of the soldiers carried were actually being repatriated from prisoner of war camps, Union soldiers, and the steamboat blow up, and as Dan says there, you see the number 1,800. You imagine you survived the war, you're being sent home, exchanged out of prisoner of war camp, and the ship you're on blows up and kills you.
Oh, gosh. So this envelope has an enormous history to it. I can't even imagine what, Gary, the cost of this would be if it were sold today at public auction.
I don't know.
Major rarity. Next, Kitty. Speaking of envelopes that have a story, this is a Valentine. It is absolutely spectacular. Thomas Jefferson is on the adhesive stamp paying the 10-cent Confederate rate going into Shelbyville, Tennessee. The Valentine is scripted on the left-hand side and was initially an enclosure. Next. Union Valentine as well. Incoming blockade mail, very difficult to get communications from the Confederacy over to England or Europe and vice versa coming into the States. Wilmington, Wilmington is still available as a port of entry in late November of 1863. Next. Outgoing blockades going into New York. Finally, Trans-Mississippi Mail, 40-cent rate to cross the Mississippi. Next. A document from John Reagan, Postmaster General. Next. And my presentation, folks, is basically over. The Civil War Philatelic Society, of which I am a member, publishes a journal, and it's really an exceptional journal. If you're a stamp collector and you love the American Civil War, this is a fantastic journal to use. And I do have, I'm a trustee in this organization, and I do have some applications for membership. If you'd like more information, I'd lovely to share it with you. But that's basically the story of the Confederate mail and the Union mail through the Civil War. Thank you for being so attentive.
Okay, any questions for Dan? A great presentation. I enjoyed it.
Let's start with this young man over on the right-hand side. Yes, sir.
You showed an envelope going across the Mississippi, and it had 4 stamps on there.
Yes.
What would that be in today's value as far as, obviously 3 cents back then was a lot of money.
Right.
What would 40 cents be going across the?
Well, first of all, it's Confederate money.
Oh,
And inflation was rampant during that time period. Gary, do you have an answer to that question? I don't have an answer to that question.
Was he asking about the rate?
What was the value? What was the equivalent value going across the Mississippi River for 40 cents? What was 40 cents worth back in 1863?
What was inflation?
Yeah.
1863? I don't know. It'd be hundreds of dollars probably today. Inflation, to give you an idea, of course, with inflation today, it doesn't seem like much, but during the Civil War, by the end of the Civil War, flour was costing like $200 a barrel. And it started out, $1, $2 at the beginning of the war. So they were running like 200% inflation or more. And they had riots.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
Right.
Because of it.
Sure.
Dan, 2 questions. First, I noticed in the presentation of the Southern stamps, you mentioned Philadelphia as being a source of one of those stamps. I thought Philadelphia was a pretty strong Northern.
No, I misspoke if that was the case. The stamps were...
Maybe I misunderstood.
Yeah, no, Confederate stamps were manufactured either in only in Richmond, Virginia.
Okay.
Other than those that came across the Atlantic Ocean, Thomas De La Rue and Company from Europe. Okay. So there was no communications whatsoever with Philadelphia.
Okay, which leads to the next question. How is the revenue controlled? That is, a stamp was sold. How did that work mechanically from the standpoint of, you getting stamps? We go to the post office, we give them a $20 bill, and we get stamps, okay? How did it work in those days?
Boy, that's a great question, and I've never been asked that question before. I got to think about sure, my only answer would be, if you were in a small town, it would have been very similar to, Akron, Ohio today, or Cleveland, or Little Rock, Arkansas. I mean, there was a system by which local postmasters passed cash up the line to the treasury of the Confederacy, or Montgomery Blair to the Union. So
there was a physical place you went to buy a stamp, obviously.
oh yeah, there was
and that money then
stayed within that system.
Okay.
Yeah, postmasters were responsible for the cash coming into the post office, where then they would have to make sure that it went to the next level, whatever that was. Any other questions?
Yeah, we got some questions over here.
This is some general questions. If you have an envelope with a stamp on it that you think has some value to it, should you leave it on the envelope or can you cut it off?
Great question. Great, absolute spectacular question. Last week, I'm in an antique shop. I'll tell you where it was, Wexford. My standard question, do you have any old envelopes, letters, or postage stamps? Oh, yeah. So here's someone that gave to me envelopes with, they call it cut squares. They cut off all the stamps. How much is it worth? I said, that's how much it's worth. Because the moment the stamp is cut off the envelope, you've destroyed the value of the envelope. And so my suggestion would be, please never, never do it. It's a shame, it's a real tragedy. But what happened was most of these were cut off in the 1940s, 1950s, when stamp collecting was really, really building. The American Philatelic Society was adding, 150, 200 members every quarter because of the popularity of taking an envelope, cutting off the stamp, and putting it in a book. So I can have my book filled with all my stamps. And they destroyed the value of the envelope, which to me is the most important part of the entire story. Does that help at all?
Thank you. I have 2 additional questions.
Oh my goodness, what is your name?
Ryan.
Hi, Ryan, yes.
I've run across sheets of stamps. Should I leave them in the sheets?
Okay, great question. I've run across sheets of stamps. Should I leave them in the sheets? Here's the sad story of the rest of the story. The United States Post Office makes a lot of money selling stamps. The moment they don't have to have the cost side of delivery, they're operating on a positive cash basis. And what happens was, back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, even 70s, even today, people are rushing to the post office to buy blocks of 4. Here's the problem. You can't use them for anything other than postage, because there's not a stamp dealer who's going to buy that sheet and pay you face value for the cost of that stamp. So when I mail letters today, I'm using stamps that were issued in 1940, 1950. I'm taking sheets and taking them off. Because my 12-cent block, I have to put 2 on the envelope, and there's no room to go to 60 cents. So I have to go to the post office and actually get extra adhesives put on the board. So my sense would be, if it's used after 1940, use it for postage. Bad news.
Okay. And the last question, I ran across some stamps of Princess Di. Are they worth any money, or what?
All right, I'm not qualified. You've crossed the line now. It's not United States philately. It's European philately. So now the collecting market would be probably strong, and it's probably the image of her at an antique shop that would be more value. So people would overpay possibly even for it. But I really can't tell you what a Princess Di stamp is worth today.
Okay, any other questions for Dan?
Yeah, I want to, Dan is also a Vietnam veteran. He served in Vietnam. He is the foremost expert on the North Vietnamese postal history. Why don't you, I'm serious about this, in the United States. Why don't you tell a little bit about your experiences in Vietnam and the North Vietnamese postal history?
Oh my goodness.
How the North Vietnamese soldiers from the South communicated with their loved ones in the North.
Okay. Well, let me take you back to August 1967. I'm in a horrific firefight with the 326th Division of the NVA. These people don't run. These are professional soldiers. And one of my squad leaders taps me on the shoulders and says, "Lieutenant, what is it?" I'm calling it an airstrike. And we just killed a courier, and we captured a mail bag. Now, I'm a stamp collector and a cover collector in 1967 in August. I open up this bag, and I'm looking at it, and here are magnificent patriotic covers of B-52s being shot down by MiGs, of MiGs strafing Marines at Quai San and Can Tien. And I said, oh my goodness. So I said to myself, let's see, can I put a few of these in here, and take them back? But the answer was no. I had to obviously put them on it. But I knew then that this existed. And so when I got back to the United States over a period of time, I began to add and buy these. And there was one major in the Army who brought back hundreds himself because he was in intelligence and they would have been destroyed, and they were sold, so I began to acquire some of these that he had, and I put together a gold medal collection of NVA postal history. So maybe at some time we want to share that as well, because
You've been back to Vietnam and you've been to
yeah.
NVA.
Yeah, Kitty and I have been back as missionaries to Vietnam at least 6, 7 times, and I met a person that tried to kill me in June of 1967. His name is Bog Lao, and Bog was with the 326th NVA Division, and I had my maps in Hanoi at a museum, and I showed him exactly where I was. He was there where I was as a lieutenant, and we actually were trying to kill each other the same day, the same time. Today he drives me around Hanoi on his motorcycle. I know his family. And interestingly enough, here, it helped me bring closure to my experiences, Gary, because what it did was it showed me that here's a man who's doing exactly what his government told him to do. He doesn't hate anybody. He's doing exactly what his government to do, and I'm in the same place doing exactly what my government told me to do. So it's not like these are bad guys and good guys. We're doing whatever our governments are basically telling us to do for whatever reason we collided in July of 67. Do you have anything you want to say to that, Kitty? No? Okay.
Okay.
Great
anything-
question.
Anything else for Dan?
I can tell a funny joke about Vietnam. I work part-time at Home Depot. And we meet a whole diverse of people coming in there. And one of my associates was waiting on a Vietnam person, and he spoke English, and this associate said he was in Vietnam and he fought over there. And a couple weeks later, the guy comes back, the Vietnam guy comes back, and he's got all these other Vietnamese with him. And he says, "This guy shot at Granddad."
That's quite a story. Yes, yes, yes. Well, again, thank you very much for allowing me the privilege of being able to share this story with you. For you stamp collectors, I want to encourage you to keep pressing in. It's interesting that I'm looking at a lot of gray hair as I have my gray hair and mustache. The American Philatelic Society, believe it today, in State College is growing, and guess what membership we're recruiting? Retirees who have plenty of time to play with stamps. And interesting that it's not the young people that are coming into the hobby, Gary, it's the older people who are more tied with American history and the desire to build a collection.
And then you might mention who's the most famous stamp collector in America.
Mr. Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, yeah.
Roosevelt spent hours. That was his relaxation. He couldn't play ball. Serious.
Right, yeah.
He would spend hours sometimes each day relaxing with his stamp collection.
Queen Elizabeth was a collector also.
Queen Elizabeth, as Kitty's saying, was a collector as well, right?
Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dan. See you next week.